The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to the ILSOY Advisor webinar on critical management strategies brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. My name is Kendall Herron and I will be moderating the webinar today. A couple of housekeeping items. If you included your CCA number when you registered for this webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in crop management. If you are listening to a recording of this webinar, you will need to go to the Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and apply for a self-study credit. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during the webinar by submitting your question through the chat feature. There will also be time for a question and answer at the end of the presentation. Please keep questions brief and only on point. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce AJ Woodyard. AJ is a technical crop production specialist at BASF. Today, he will cover planting date, soybean population, maturity group, seed treatment, foliar fungicides, and soybean fertility needs. Take it away, AJ.
All right. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of those on the line, wherever you may be. I am here today at our research site just outside of Champaign, Illinois. It's a bit of a gloomy morning here today. We've had off and on showers the past few days, so not a lot of field activity currently going on. And unfortunately, no soybeans going in the ground today. But we're looking forward to hopefully another good, interesting growing season where we can hopefully have a profitable year and learn a lot of things. So I am, just to do a brief introduction of myself, I actually grew up on a corn and soybean operation in East Central Illinois, still a part of that operation today. And I have been with BASF for just about 8.5 years now, and in various roles, but currently my role is responsibility for our research, trial work, and agronomic education around high-yield corn and soybean production. And you'll find I'm a bit of a soybean nerd. That's really my true passion, and a lot of where my expertise lies is in soybean management. And I'm fortunate to work not only here at our site in Illinois, but also with grower operations across the U.S. Had the opportunity to work alongside even Randy Dowdy down in Georgia that raised 171 bushel beans. So it's been a good opportunity to learn a lot of things about soybean management and some of the changes that we've seen over the past, say, 5 to 8 years and how we manage soybeans. And so the purpose of what I'm going to do today is share a lot of the things that we have determined are important for management and yield in soybeans, and hopefully this is a precursor to us being able to get into the field and implement some of these strategies here over the next few weeks to month or so. And of course, if there's any questions about some of the things we're going to share, please fire away. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So one of the things that I've found most important in management of soybeans and my time and working with a lot of different people in a lot of different research environments is that finding the right bushel really comes down to building the best crop. And so the most simple way I can put this is farming is a psychological game. We all know that. For those of us that are involved in it, I can tell you, even on our own operation, we're more likely to invest into high yields and crop management when we have a crop that looks good versus a crop that visually we don't believe has the yield potential. In that scenario, we're less likely to want to invest in strategies that can help us improve yields. And so thus it becomes kind of a synergistic interaction of agronomy and good agronomic practices up front to go along with the crop management strategies we can utilize in crop. And so the two pictures I've got on the slide here that you'll see on the right hand side give a good example of that kind of psychological aspect of soybean production. So on the top picture you see earlier planted soybeans close to a full canopy. We've got good weed control, dark green color. In that instance, our psychological interests are going to be much higher in investing on the backside in crop management in that crop end season to try to maximize yield, both with, again, good agronomy, good crop management. The bottom picture you see is the exact opposite. So in that scenario, with weeds interacting with the crop early in the year, later planted, smaller soybeans, not intercepting as much light. In that case, are we going to be as interested in investing in crop management in season? It may be less likely from a psychological perspective because we don't believe we've got that same yield potential there. So we've got to take a lot of factors into consideration when we think about management, building the baseline of good agronomics to take advantage of. And I've got a list of some of those things. It might include planting date, maturity group and plant population, residual weed control, fertility, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll discuss a lot of those today. But I think the key takeaway here is that positively influencing all those factors and finding that synergistic interaction of agronomy along with crop management in season gives you really the best opportunity to build the best crop. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, one thing that I always stress is extremely important is that soybeans are light harvesters. And if we think about the differences between soybeans and corn, corn, for example, is what I would consider to be a sink limited crop. And what I mean by that is we're trying to put on as many ears onto the corn plants, so as many plants out there to get as many ears as we can, and then our objective is to try to maximize the size of those ears. But it's really, we're limited by how many plants we can put out there in order to properly manage those ears. We're sink limited. In the case of soybeans, it's a little bit different. I would consider soybeans to be more of a source limited crop in that we put on a large number of flowers and pods, more than we'll ever keep on the crop. And in fact, anybody who's walked out into a soybean field in July or August, you've probably seen flowers or pods being aborted on plants when you go through some sort of a stress. And so we think of soybeans more as a source limited crop, in that our objective is to think of them as solar panels and intercept as much light through the season as we can. And it's really all about harvesting light. And we also have to think about when we're intercepting that light. And so with soybeans, we also want to consider maximizing light interception at critical points during the year. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also strategies we can implement to try to maximize photosynthesis in season. Because the bottom line is light drives everything with soybeans. It's going to drive flower set, it's going to drive pod set, it's going to drive grain fill. And so everything we can do to maximize light interception, maximize light at the right times of the year is going to give us a chance to be set up for yield. So I always like to preface any discussion we have about management strategies with the idea of how do we get more soybean yield? Because the bottom line is we need to understand what things we need to influence within the plant in order to produce more yield. And specific to soybeans, there's really three things that we'd focus on. We want to try to increase either the number of pods per acre, the number of seeds per pod, or the weight per seed, or all the above if we can. But we're always thinking about how our management strategies can influence these yield factors. And we'll discuss here also through the presentation how some of our different management strategies may influence these three yield aspects. But I think this is an important baseline piece of information to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. So as we've done and implemented a lot of our research work over the years, one of the things that we spend a lot of time focusing on right out of the gate as I started doing some of this research 8 or 9 years ago was the importance of planting date. And this is one that I can't stress enough as one of those foundational pieces. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the phone here today in Illinois or in Arkansas, in Nebraska, the concept is going to hold the same here. The dates may change, but the concept holds the same, and that planting date is an important driver for yield in soybeans. And we'll share some of the things that we've learned through that process. One of those I'm going to call something that we thought we used to know. And this is something that we've also tested a lot, and it's the importance of the conditions that we plant into as we go out there and put our soybeans in the ground this spring. And I titled this as What We Thought We Knew, because this is the things you see on this slide are things that I was taught in agronomy school And guidelines that I typically used in the past, say 3 or 4 years ago, in determining when we should go and start planting soybeans. And so the rule of thumb in the past has been that you don't want to plant soybeans unless you're going to get soil temperatures above 50 degrees on average in the first 24 hours of planting. And the reason why that's always been stressed historically is that you have what they call the imbibitional phase of the soybean seed in the first 24 hours, and that it's going to drink water regardless of what temperature it is. So whether that water is 65 degrees in the soil or whether that water is 35 degrees, it's going to be taking a drink, it's going to be imbibing in the first 24 hours. And so if you look at what we thought we've known, if we have those temperatures below 50 degrees in the first 24 hours, the thought was you're at risk for chilling injury, which could potentially influence your final stands later in the year. Now, after the first 24 hours, soybean goes into what we call the osmotic phase. At that point, basically, it's going to drink water as it deems its temperature appropriate. Chilling injury becomes less of a concern at that point. But that was kind of the focus and how I used as my guideline in the past for determining when to plant soybeans, was looking at the forecast, determining when we believe soil temperatures would be above 50 degrees in the first 24 hours. And of course, we had what we consider to be fit soil conditions, moisture-wise, and then we gave the green light to plant. So I'm going to go through a little bit of information just to kind of describe some of the research we've done investigating this a little further. And I'm going to start in 2015. And so 2015, we actually had the opportunity to go out on April 1st. And again, this is just outside of Champaign, Illinois. So April 1st, not what would be considered a commercially standard or normal planting date. This is much earlier. And we went out, had actually reasonable soil conditions. So we had temperatures just above 50 degrees in the first 24 hours. And we had, I would call the soils tacky, but not in too terrible shape for early April. And we went out and planted one variety on April 1st and got a final stand versus our target of 70%, as you can see there in the top line of the slide. So, yep, we did lose 30% of our stand, but when we look at an April 1st planting date, 70% of our stand still probably enough to maximize yield. And we'll talk a little bit more about seeding rates as we go through the presentation. But 70% April 1st, we'd be pleased with that. Starting April 17th, we've got 5 planting dates following that, in which we planted 4 maturity groups at 3 different planting or seeding rates, and at each one of those particular planting dates. And I've got these all color coded, so you'll notice that I've got April 1st and April 23rd in orange, April 17th in yellow, and then our May and June planting dates in green. This basically correlates to the conditions or the risk that we associated with that particular planting date in terms of potential stand loss, based on what we believed that we knew in the past. And so if you look at April 17th, I've got that one coded in yellow. It really was a good date in April. We had 58-degree soil temperatures and near 80% final stands versus target, so we look very good there. April 23rd, that was a day that we were being asked, should we park the planters or should we keep going, knowing that there was going to be some cold temperatures and a cold rain coming in following on the 24th and 25th, I believe. And so we were actually commercially telling guys, I think it's probably best off to stop the soybean planters. However, we of course have the opportunity to do a research plot. We put that in. Indeed, we did see 42-degree soil temperatures in the first 24 hours, well below 50, and yet we still saw about a 70% final stand versus target. And one of the things that I would also stress is that there were clear varietal differences. So there were varieties that tended to handle, or varietal lots that tended to handle the colder conditions better than others. And that's one thing I think to keep in mind if you're looking at planting into more difficult conditions. It may be worth looking at a cold germination test, saturated cold germ on your seed to determine what seed may handle that cooler conditions even better. When we get to May, you can see that soil temperatures were warm and overall our final stands were good versus target. It's rare that I see final stands any higher than about 92 or 93% versus a target. That's about as good as you're going to get. So one of the things that we're capable of doing with our team of interns during the summer is we actually are able to monitor the total number of days that those soybean plants are out in the field from the point they emerge to the point they reach maturity. And so this is an average of our 4 varieties, our 4 maturity groups, and that ranges from in this particular case, a 2.9 to a 4.1. So that was our range of maturity groups. And this is an average across all 4. And you can see here that basically regardless of whether we planted on April 17th or May 1st, we had the same total number of days from emergence to maturity. And in conjunction, our growing degree units were relatively similar as well. And so those numbers held true and would tell us that it probably didn't matter whether we planted the 17th or May 1st in terms of total amount of light or heat accumulated. That was not going to be a yield limiting factor. The yield limiting factor was going to be the weather conditions, say around the time we planted. Did we plant in more difficult conditions in one versus another, or did we get maybe a timely rain on the back end that may have influenced one planting date more than another? So that the total number of days was not an influencer on yield on those 3 dates. Now, if we look at May 22nd, we now see we've lost 12 days, so almost 10% of our total growing days, and a similar trend on heat accumulation was lost by planting in later May. And that would tell us that in this particular case, we're not just limited by weather, we're also limited by the total amount of source or the total amount of sunlight that those plants can take up. We look at June 5th, we've now dropped an additional about 7 or 8%. We're down almost 18% versus our total days in April and May, early May. And so clearly in this case, we have the potential to be limited by just not having as much growing season to take advantage of in that particular later date. So when we look at the final yields and correlate that to those planting dates, what you'll notice is, again, I mentioned that April 17th through May 1st, we had the same total number of days. You'll note that April 17th and May 1st had almost identical yields, averaged across all 4 maturity groups. And so you can see that is clearly there. The April 23rd date, see I've got that coded in orange. That date was, again, a more challenging planting date. We saw a little bit of a yield loss there. I will tell you that was specific to 1 or 2 varieties in the trial that just didn't handle cold conditions well. But you will note that the April 23rd date still provided higher yields than May 22nd. And so there still was some advantage there, even with the more difficult emergence over a late planting date. And then out to June 5th, again, you see that trend moving down even further. If we look at another interesting piece of information that we can gain from this, we can actually look at the amount of time each of those planting dates spent in various growth stages. And so what we've got here, the orange bar in this chart is an average of the 2 April planting dates and May 1st, because they all had very similar total number of days. The green bar is May 22nd, the yellow bar is June 5th. And across the bottom, you see the various different growth stages that those soybeans will go through throughout the growing year. And this basically gives us the total number of days spent in each growth stage by planting date. And there's some really interesting pieces of info that came out of this. First and foremost, we're historically taught that soybeans are a photoperiod dependent crop. And what that means is that basically as soybeans get past the longest day of the year, the summer solstice on June 21st, depending on maturity group, they're going to start flowering subsequently after the days start getting shorter. And the longer maturity groups will flower a little bit later than the early maturing groups. So based on that information, what we would believe is that if we planted in late May or early June, we would spend much fewer days in vegetative growth than if we planted, say, April 17th or May 1st. Because, again, we're pushing that closer to the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. You would expect would take less time for you to get into flowering if we believed what we historically know. What's interesting about this work is if you look at the vegetative days on the far left-hand side, it didn't matter whether you planted April 17th or May 22nd. We actually spent the exact same number of days in vegetative growth. And so what that tells us is that there's likely some sort of heat unit accumulation as well that can trigger flowering. Now, why is that important? Well, again, remember that the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, about 2 weeks on both sides of that summer solstice, we're intercepting the most light that we're going to intercept all year. And if we can plant those soybeans earlier and get a heat unit accumulation trigger to flowering, then we can actually get flowering occurring ahead of the summer solstice, get those plants into reproductive stages while we're intercepting maximum light, and now we're using that light to drive flower and pod set rather than using it for vegetative growth. So there's some real benefits there. Another interesting piece on this slide, if you look out to R5 through R7, this is seed fill. You see that it didn't matter which date that you planted, you spent the same amount of time in seed fill, which was interesting and a bit of a surprise to us. Now, I'm going to put a red circle around R2. You'll note that at R2, which is full flower, the time the beans are going from about boot top tall up to, say, mid-thigh in height, we picked up an extra 8 to 10 days of growth in the R2 stage. Why is that important? Well, with soybeans, it's all about getting nodes on the plant. The more nodes you have, the more potting sites you have for those soybean plants. So by getting more nodes, by spending more time in R2, we're actually putting more nodes on those plants. More nodes gives us more potting sites, more potential for yield. So a lot of information to be gathered from that particular work. In addition, just to close down what we saw in 2015, our April 1st planting date, we had one maturity group represented here. This was a bit of an eye-opening experience for us because we actually had our best yields on our April 1st planting date. So what you may have thought to be contrary and kind of crazy by planting that early, we actually picked up our highest yields in this case. And those soybeans actually did go through 2 light frost events, so some 30 and 31 degree nights. Did not kill off plants at that temperature. Now, of course, if we would have been down to 26 or 27 degrees, it would have been a different story. But that's sort of the risk and reward that you'll see associated with planting dates in soybeans. So with that, I'm going to quickly transition to 2016, cover a little bit of what we did there. We thought in 2016, well, we tried April 1st. Why not get really crazy and try a March 21st planting date? And it was dry enough in the I guess still, well, that may have been the first day of spring, but in the winter/spring of 2016 that we were able to get a planting date out in March. And we actually, these soybeans ended up taking 30 days to emerge. So planted March 21st, they didn't emerge until April 20th. And yet, and you see in the first 24 hours, we had 37 degrees in our soil temperatures. So that would have been far contrary from what you would have wanted to have done. It would seem crazy, in fact. And yet somehow, even after being in the ground for 30 days, we had an 88% final stand versus target in this particular date. So this was, again, we would not be promoting, say, commercially planting on March 21st maybe, but at the same time, this is pretty interesting information to say those soybeans are vigorous enough with a seed treatment on them to sit in the ground for 30 days and still emerge. We had additionally a planting date on March 30th, and then you see in April, I've got those first 2 dates in April, or the 2 planting dates in April coded in green. They were excellent planting dates for soybeans, good temperatures, great final stands over 90%. May 6th was Mother's Day weekend ahead of that, and the kind of Mother's Day planting challenges that we had this past year in a lot of the Corn Belt. That was one of our tougher dates, so I coded that one in yellow. So we did see a little bit of a drop in our final stand versus target there. And then, of course, we finished out with a late May and an early June planting date as well. One thing that we focus on is looking at what growth stage we get soybean plants to by the summer solstice. and then also how much light is being intercepted by the plants versus how much is being intercepted by the soil. So these photos were taken underneath the canopy. We have what we call our soybean selfie stick, and it's a camera that goes underneath the canopy, shoots a picture up above, and it actually gives us measurements of how much light is being intercepted by the plants versus how much is being intercepted by the soil, or Mother Earth in this case. And so we do this every year on the summer solstice because we find it to be extremely important to try to get our soybeans into the reproductive stages at the very least by the time we get to June 20th. That's something that is a target of ours. And so this is all 30-inch rows in this case. I'm going to show narrower rows in the next slide. But April 18th, 30-inch rows, we're at the R2 growth stage, so we're where we want to be in reproductive growth, and we're using 51% of the light by the plant, 49% is being intercepted by the soil. On May 6th, you see we're not in the reproductive stages in this particular case, and we are utilizing 35% of the light by the plant versus 65% by the soil. When we get out to a late May planting date on June 20th, when the photos were taken, we're in the vegetative stages at V4, and we're utilizing 12% of the light by the plants versus 88% to the soil. So now you see how the importance of light interception. Longest day of the year, we're intercepting a lot of light on June 20th. We want as much of that going to the plant and towards reproductive growth as we can possibly accomplish. The next slide here, again, this is the April 18th in 30-inch rows versus planting date 2 days later, the same variety in 15-inch rows. And now you can see how 15-inch rows help us utilize even more light. We're up to 85% in this case, which is good for a couple reasons. One, to utilize that light by the plant rather than the soil, but also think about what's germinating underneath that canopy. We've got weeds germinating, right? So the more of that light we can block out, the more we try to keep those weeds at bay as well, using a cultural practice in this case. Again, looking at the correlation of total number of growing days to yield, the trend looks a little bit different in 2016. And when I first saw the yield data, I was a little bit surprised until we put together this information with it. And what you see here is that even on April 18th, we actually bought ourselves a few more days and a few more GDUs as well from emergence to maturity versus April 25th. And then you see a big drop off to May 6th. A lot of that was due to the challenges of emergence on that May 6th date. They just took longer to emerge, and it almost pushed those out into what would be like a mid to late May planting date. And then you see then at June 8th, again, you see the drop off out to June 8th. That's an average of 4 maturity groups at each of those planting dates, from a 2.9 to a 4.0. And you see the correlating yield data that comes with that. So very interesting here, in that the trend of total number of days from emergence to maturity is not too far off of the final yield data averaged across those same varieties. We had even about a 4 bushel advantage to April 18th over April 25th, and from April 18th all the way out to June 8th, a 24 bushel swing in yield and across these 4 varieties. The March 21st planting, for those that might be curious and how that ended out in 2016, we had large pod clusters on top of these plants. Pretty amazing given everything they went through trying to emerge. To throw pod clusters like this is kind of a rare occurrence. It's difficult to get those pod clusters and maintain them in the central corn belt. A lot easier to do if you're in Arkansas, Mississippi, or Georgia. So we were very pleased with the potting that we had on these plants, and almost unbelievably, those March 21st beans ended up being our best yielding beans. So the trend held similar to what we had seen in 2015. And in this case, from March 21st to June 8th, there's almost a 28 bushel yield difference there from top to bottom. And again, are we promoting a March 21st planting date? Everybody go out and plant in March in Illinois? No. But what we are sharing with you is, I think, some compelling information about the physiology of soybeans and what potentially does drive high yield potential. Certainly a lot of risk associated with it, but there, for 2 years in a row anyways, has been some pretty good rewards. This is kind of a busy slide here, but it makes a great point. And so I want to make sure we share this, because solar radiation, again, is so critical for soybeans. And if you look at the solar radiation pattern for our location in Illinois this year, what we've got on this chart, the center line that you see, the zeros running right across the middle, is the 10-year average for solar radiation for our location. The yellow bars that you see going above and below that line, that center line, is the deviation of each individual day from the 10-year average. And the blue line is the cumulative running average, basically. So one thing that you'll note is that early on in the year, in June, we had way above average solar radiation in general, and we had a lot of sunny days. When we got into July and August, we were well below average, and you see that cumulative average drop very quickly when we get later in the year. March 21st, that planting date began R1, began reproductive phases on June 6th. So you see that for the month following the point which those reached R1, we had above average light solar radiation that was driving a flower and initial pod set in that first month on those March beans. Now compare that to May 23rd. They began R1 a little over a month later, on July 9th basically, and look at the month following the beginning of R1 on those May 23rd beans. Far below average solar radiation. Probably an influencing factor on why we saw such big differences in the yields on those two planting dates. That's some interesting info there. So, we've talked a little bit about early planting and the value that can come from that, but obviously there are also a lot of stresses we have to deal with in earlier plantings. One of those, especially if you're on the western side of the state or over in eastern Iowa, is sudden death syndrome. That's one that's really been a challenge. And so we have to look at options to help manage some of those stresses. The picture on the left is a couple of my interns standing in some really early planted beans last summer. They are two vertically challenged young ladies, but nonetheless, those were really tall beans that we had there in that case. And in those particular trials, we had done some work looking at various seed treatments. So we had an Acceleron-based seed treatment alone, and then in addition, we added a levo to that seed treatment, as well as Preaxor and Furrow in various strips, and you could see some extreme visual differences where we did have some SDS, sudden death syndrome, showing up on very early beans. The Alevo provided us some good benefits there, and so I think that's one thing to consider, whether it's genetics or seed treatment options. If you're in an area where you deal with something like an SDS and you do want to try to plant earlier, you've got to think about strategies you're going to put in place to manage that. And in that case, our treatment of having the Alevo and Preaxor and Furrow gave us a little over 11 bushels response versus our standard seed treatment. And so a big benefit in this case where we did have some early season stress. Okay, I'm going to transition here to, real quickly, I want to touch on weed control, and it's going to be very brief. Obviously, we all are dealing with and trying to manage a lot of weed populations, water hemp being the main one. This is a pretty familiar site that I've seen in a lot of my travels looking at soybeans all around. Water hemp's becoming more and more of an issue to manage, and I think we have to really consider and rethink the strategies we put in place to deal with this weed. What we used to think was an issue just further south is an issue in most all of the corn belt as you travel now. And so when we think about kind of how we manage this weed, what has traditionally been a common practice has been to use a pre-plant herbicide, but I want you to really pay attention to the modes of action in the herbicide program that you're putting into place as you look at 2017. And so I'm giving you an example of what I've seen as a common practice, which is a Group 2 ALS herbicide plus a Group 14 herbicide pre-emergence, followed by a Group 9 Roundup in this case, plus if we need it, we add in another group 14 like a Cobra or a Flexstar, et cetera, in to try to kill water hemp that may be emerged that we believe is Roundup resistant. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the issue with this strategy? And the issue is that water hemp, in this particular case, is resistant to a lot of those herbicides. And we've got, pretty good evidence from the University of Illinois that a large percentage may be resistant to both glyphosate and the PPO, the group 14 herbicides. So if you look at this, you can eliminate, in a lot of cases, the ALS and Roundup. I'm just going to put a red line through those. Those aren't doing a whole lot for you. And so you're very reliant in this particular practice on your group 14 herbicide. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So your group 14 herbicide is where you're really reliant. And the issue I see here is that with our post group 14s, we know there's a lot of resistance out there, and that's then putting a lot of pressure on our pre-plant group 14 residual. So something I'm going to tell you to consider is really thinking about the program you put in place and ensuring that you've got plenty of effective sites of action in your tank mixes every time that you go across that field. Because something that's been addressed in a lot of research by the University of Illinois is that fields with 2.5 effective sites of action per application in every trip across the field, having 2.5 sites of action, you're 83 times less likely to develop resistance than fields with 1.5. And that's a pretty compelling story in support of getting effective modes of action in those tank mixes. It may not even always be about just rotating herbicides as much as it is getting effective herbicides in the tank when you make those trips. I am having a little bit of technical. Okay. You gotta love technology. Looks like I've frozen up a little bit here. Well, daggone it. Okay. All right, we're going to try this, reset this thing. I apologize. This is what happens when you've got technology that is too old. All right, let's reload this and give it a go again. Okay, get back where we were. Okay, my apologies. So bottom line here on the herbicide front is I think it's important to consider the various products you're using in that system, and a group 15 herbicide is something that I believe is an important consideration for that program moving forward. So looking at a combination not just of your group 14 PPOs, but look at something that can help protect that technology, because the likelihood of weed management being one of your toughest challenges is a reality, and we've got to use all of our tools to protect those herbicide options. Okay, so that was my little short bit on herbicides. I want to touch just a little bit on following up on some of our planting date work, looking at plant populations or seeding rates as well as maturity groups, and some of the importance of thinking about that as you get into the growing season here. Soybean lodging is something that we deal with pretty much on a yearly basis in Illinois, especially when you're in high yield management systems. Is that something we should worry about? I'm going to argue that it is. You can see here that we've got on the left hand side 200,000 plants per acre, and in that case on the left hand side of that yellow line, those soybeans are lodging compared to 140,000 plants per acre, in this case standing well. And eventually that 140,000 plants is probably going to lodge, but the benefit of getting an extra 10 to say 10 days to 14 days of those plants standing is huge in terms of the ability of those plants to be able to photosynthesize and place yield on critical parts of that plant later in the year. And so one of the things that I've really focused a lot of time on is understanding how seeding rates may influence planting, may be influenced by our planting dates, and should this be something that's dynamic that we should be changing based on when we're planting soybeans. And to kind of show you what we're going to have here, I've got my 5 planting dates. We've got our 3 seeding rates, so 128,000, 160, and 192 in the green, yellow, and white bar. And I've got our final stands listed there as well. And you'll notice on April 18th that in reality, we had our best yields at our lowest seeding rates. And again, I think this is important to remember, in that it may be backwards to what we think, but our earlier planting dates, those plants are going to compete with each other longer. They're going to put on more nodes. And so if you've got too many plants there, they compete with each other, create spindly plants, and they start to lodge. And there's some real benefit, we've seen this year after year, to actually lower seeding rates at our earlier planting dates. You see the same thing on April 25th. That gap is closing a little bit, but still a benefit to the lowest seeding rate. On May 6th, still the same story. A little bit of the gap is closing, but still a benefit to the lower seeding rate. By the time we get out to late May, we may start to want to rethink that seeding rate at this point, because as we get to late May and early June, now it's not, we have to think about having the fact that each individual plant isn't going to put on as many nodes. And so what we have to compensate for that is by getting more plants out there to get more total nodes in the field. And so typically as we get into later May, we want to start increasing our populations. You'll note in 2016, those numbers are still pretty similar on the low population and the middle population. However, I think 2016 was a unique year in that we just had tremendous growth on these plants. Normally, I would tell you by May 23rd, you'd want to be closer to that 160,000 plus seeding rate at that point. When you get out to June 8th, you'll notice we don't have the lowest seeding rate, but you'll see that 192,000 seeded rate, or 173,000 final stand, was our best yield in our June planting date. We needed more plants to compensate there on our later planting dates for the yield potential. So earlier planting dates, we don't need as many plants. As we get later in the year, this is a dynamic system. We've got to get more plants out there. I tell you, this is frustrating. Get on it. So I'm going to kind of talk as I try to pull this up, because this is I really apologize, it's frustrating. But maturity groups is the next thing I'm going to talk about. And so as a general theme, our maturity groups, what we like to see is, as we're planting earlier, we want to have a longer season bean in that case. And so we tend to focus more towards our long season varieties planted in our April or early May planting dates. As we get out into and you can see that here on this slide, that our early season varieties are not yielding quite as well planted early as our long season varieties. Now, as we get into our let's say mid-May to late May planting dates, we tend to not see much difference between our early and late season varieties. And so the advice I would give you there is that you'll want, if we can't plant until May 15th this year, you may want to think about planting those early season beans first and then move towards your later season beans, because as you get out to late May or early June, there's actually value to going back to longer season beans. But in that middle time frame, from say May 10th to May 25th or so, you don't see a whole lot of difference. And so this is, again, another dynamic factor that changes based on when we can plant. Just a couple other things I was going to touch on, hopefully before my computer tries to blow up again, is think about also where your yield is coming from on a soybean plant. The critical nodes are typically numbers 5 through 16. They're going to give you 80 to 85% of your soybean yield. So the middle of the plant is where your money is. You got to protect those critical nodes in the middle of that plant. And this was a real common sight I saw this year in a lot of places where we didn't manage stresses in season, whether they be insects or diseases. We saw a whole bunch of pods laying on the ground. And in this case, you see 11 viable pods in our hands there in a 1 square foot section I had drawn in a field in the eastern side of Iowa. And again, a lot of that was due to the stresses of insects feeding on those plants, and we just lost pods there because of that. The other thing that I think was a huge additional yield driver in season in 2016 was plant health and fungicide applications. We were seeing very commonly 4 to 7 bushel increases, and some of that was due to the insecticides protecting pods and pod fill. Some of that was due to the fungicide helping us, and Preaxor in this case, helping us increase photosynthesis when we had that low solar radiation. So again, we have to think about anything we can do to increase photosynthesis under low light conditions. Look at what it looked like in 2016 from R3 to R6. So that was grain fill. It's grain fill, and we were well below average on solar radiation. So anything we could do to try to improve canopy photosynthesis was going to help us protect yield. And Preaxor as a fungicide was helping us to do that. That's why I believe we saw such big differences this year on responses to fungicides. So, one of the things that I would just piggyback on that is that when you get really low solar radiation, again, light drives everything. Low solar radiation during grain fill means smaller seeds. And I want to show you something quick. The picture on the left-hand side is my hand holding our March 21st soybeans. The picture on the right-hand side there is Randy Dowdy holding his soybeans from his record-breaking effort. And so you'll notice that my soybeans with our low solar radiation during grain fill were about 3,000 seeds per pound. We were pretty disappointed in our seed size. And a lot of that was due to low solar radiation during grain fill. Randy's, on the other hand, had excellent solar radiation during grain fill. His seed size was about 2,200 seeds per pound, so very large seed size. He got us by 26% on seed weight alone in terms of yield. And if you looked at our actual yields, we were at about 101 bushel. He was at about 143 across 70 acres in his contest field. That was a 29% difference in yield. A lot of that was driven by seed weight. So we got to think about ways to try to protect seed weight as best we can. And again, it goes back to that Preaxor, that fungicide, helping us to do that. The other thing I just mentioned is use the right products in your system. That's an important thing to keep in mind too. I've got an example here of untreated versus a Preaxor product, and then also Preaxor adding an insecticide, and you see the benefits of the addition of the insecticide in this case. But there are differences in how products perform, and I just encourage you to evaluate that and make determinations of products that can consistently give you benefits if you look at trying to keep that plant alive longer and protecting it against stress. I want to close up with just one little section on understanding soybean fertility. And this is one that we're focusing a lot of effort on right now, so I don't have all the answers here, I'll be honest with you, but we're focusing a lot of time trying to understand soybean fertility and when we need certain nutrients and in what levels we need those nutrients. One way we are doing that is we have put into place some research at our location where we're evaluating foliar applications of nutrients, and you can see that on the far right-hand side, spraying foliar nutrients on an as-needed basis. We're evaluating different options for putting fertilizers on in season, such as a Y drop. And then we're also evaluating a system of fertigation, so putting water on through with a lateral or with a pivot in this case. And so we're trying to understand this in various different scenarios of soybean production, whether you're in dry land or irrigated. And you can see in that middle picture, that was our very scientific way of mixing up some nutrients into solution in a mixing vat and then pushing that through with water out onto our soybeans. We've spent a lot of time, this is information from Fred Below and Ross Bender at the University of Illinois, understanding when certain nutrients were taken up in the plant. And trying to get those nutrients in place based on the time that they're needed. But you'll note that there's some big differences if you look at, a nutrient like zinc, for example. A lot of that nutrient is taken up late in the year, and it may be different than a nutrient like iron, where you see a very rapid uptake in earlier in the season, but for that particular nutrient. So we're trying to really pay attention to when nutrients are taken up, when they're needed, and when can we supply those in a timely manner. We built these charts that kind of tell us and outline to us how much of each nutrient we need to reach certain yield levels. So in this case, we've got 80 bushel on the bottom and 100 bushel. We've got each individual nutrient, and then we've broken that out into how much of those nutrients are taken up in different quarters of the growing season. So in the first 30 days, you see that we have very little, no nutrients taken up any more than 12%. So very little uptake in the first 30 days. You really don't see a lot of that nutrient uptake occurring until you get out into the 60 to 90 day range and on out to maturity. A lot of soybean nutrient uptake occurs late in the year. I think that's something important to remember. We were tissue testing every week. So every week we've got an entire graph for every nutrient of tissue tests through the whole year. And in some cases we would see a nutrient like copper be limiting, and then we were trying to find a way to address that. In some cases we can make foliar applications and address it. In other instances we struggled to get responses for certain nutrients when we got behind. And so I think it stressed with us the importance of proactive nutrient management, understanding nutrients across the entire profile. If you're after high yields, it may not just be about phosphorus and potassium. There may be other things that we really need to become yield limiting factors as we get to these high yield particular levels, as we start to push above 80, 90, and push towards 100 bushel beans. So what did we learn? Timing really matters. The left-hand side is our average content through the year on our tissue tests for each nutrient. And on the right-hand side, you see a specific chart for zinc, where we've got the yellow line being the untreated with no foliar nutrient applications. The orange line is the treated, where we did make foliar applications. And every week we've got our tissue test plotted there. You'll note we made 3 applications of zinc. In the first 2 applications, we didn't see much of a response in the foliar tissue. And again, that was a frustration as we continue to try to evaluate different products and different methods to get zinc to the plant. That's one thing that we're continuing to put a lot of effort into. The third application, you see, we did make a difference. And however, in that case, it was about a 1-week difference before that line dropped back down. So again, I think timing matters here, and I think product selection is something that matters, and that's one thing that we're going to focus a lot of time on moving forward. So what should we watch for in soybeans this year? I'd ask you to pay attention to your flowering date in relation to the summer solstice, and see what you can learn there on your farm. Canopy closure and the summer solstice as well. When do you get to canopy closure? Count the number of nodes on those plants. See how many total nodes you're getting out there in your fields. Evaluate the health of your trifoliates associated with critical nodes, because remember that if the plant from nodes 5 to 16 is going to put on a lot of that yield, if you lose trifoliates on those specific nodes, you're likely going to have difficulty filling the beans at those particular trifoliates. Soybeans are just not as good at remobilizing nutrients across the plant as what corn is. So you got to keep those trifoliates working for you. Dig plants and assess your nodules. So you want to see light pink to pinkish colored nodules, not green or brown. That means they're inactive if they're green or brown. So always assess the health of those nodules, and then really understand the potential yield losses that are occurring out there in season and try to address those as well as you can. Again, set yourself up for success agronomically up front, and then address those potential yield losses occurring in season. So last thoughts, and then I'll answer any questions here. Sometimes you have to take some risk to earn rewards. There are strategies for, it's all about maximizing canopy photosynthesis. And you've kind of seen here the importance of light interception, getting light at the right time, that's where you're going to drive yourself to increased yields. You got agronomics and crop management together to get success. And like any other crop, sometimes it takes environmental cooperation to get those big record yields. That's just part of the challenges we all know that we face in farming, is that we sometimes need environmental cooperation. You see that big soybean plant on the right-hand side? That was one grown in South America on its own. They grow individual plants to see how big of beans they can grow. And that was the contest winner, I believe, had somewhere over 3,000 pods on one individual plant. A pretty unbelievable feat. That'd be one heck of a bean to try to cut down with your draper head, but certainly tells us there's a lot of yield potential in soybeans that we can continue to tap into. So with that, I want to first apologize for some of the technical difficulties. I hope that didn't disrupt you too much. And any questions that I can answer, I'd love to do that now.
Okay, and we do have some time for some questions. So the first one is, should you inoculate soybeans even in a 50-50 rotation?
Yeah, so inoculating soybeans is something we didn't quite get to on discussing nitrogen and the importance of that in soybeans. So we all know nitrogen is, you actually require more nitrogen in a 60 bushel, 65, 70 bushel soybean crop than you do in a 220 bushel corn crop. Soybeans require a lot of nitrogen, and there are different ways to go about getting that nitrogen, but we want to get as much of it for free as we can, and through nodulation and through the natural plant's ability to supply that nitrogen with bacterial fixation. So I am a big proponent in high yield management. So as you get into environments that you're talking 70 plus bushel beans and you're requiring a lot of nitrogen, I want to get as much of that from the soil as I can. We inoculate beans and see results in those high yield environments very consistently. So my answer to that, if you're managing and pushing yields, an inoculant even in a 50-50 rotation likely is giving you benefit. All of our very early season beans that we plant all are inoculated, yes.
Okay. Just to clarify, how low of temperatures can a small VE or VC bean plant tolerate before it dies?
Yep. So, very good question. So, it's what I'll typically tell you is if you're at 28 degrees, you're at a point where you're at, if you get any extended period at 28 degrees, you're at pretty high risk for mortality on those soybeans, and that definitely is the risk because your cotyledons come out of the ground. You've lost your growing point. Basically, if it frosts off, it's not like corn. So 28 degrees for any extended period, you've got mortality. If you're in the 30 to 31 degree range, even drop down to 29 for a short period of time, we've been able to see the beans bronze up, but keep pushing forward and haven't had an issue there.
Okay. Was there a difference in disease pressure from the late March planted beans compared to the rest of the planting dates?
Another good question. In general, at this particular site, probably the most consistent disease we deal with is septoria. Believe it or not, from a sudden death syndrome standpoint, we saw very little sudden death. The one slide I did show you with SDS in that plot, those were March planted beans on an extremely sensitive variety planted in an area that we've historically inoculated with SDS. So it was set up in a scenario to have higher levels of SDS. Across the rest of the farm, our March planting dates, really, we didn't show any difference on SDS versus some of our later planting dates. Now, granted, this is an area that hasn't historically had as much SDS. And then in terms of other diseases later in the year, no significant difference versus other planting dates.
Okay. Wouldn't you recommend an IPM strategy in treating a known disease or insect issue rather than prophylactic applications and potential resistance issues?
So I think that's another good question and good point. Again, this is one of those that comes down to the particular disease you're targeting, particular insects you're targeting, and then the levels or persistence of those applications you're making. I would argue that if you look at it at a commercial level, an R3 application of fungicide and insecticide has provided economic benefit to the level that in a lot of years it's been a strategy that growers are just going to implement in a high yield system. If you're looking at specific diseases that have potential for disease or resistance development, such as, let's say, frog eye leaf spot, for example, if that's something that you deal with, you have to look at strategies that can help you to manage and mitigate resistance there. And that could be things from seed or varietal tolerances to multiple modes of action in your fungicide applications to protect against potential resistance in those cases. You know, the thing that with fungicides that is the good thing, I guess, is that in some cases they're providing us benefits that may go beyond just disease control in terms of additional yield. And so it's still a practice that can help us, you know, for example, when we have the lower light or cloudy days and increasing canopy photosynthesis. So some of those benefits may go beyond disease, which is why they still can be important parts of that high yield management system.
Okay, we've got just a couple more questions left. Seems like we had a lot of tall soybeans with fewer pods last year. Why did that happen?
Yeah. I would tell you that was one of the big differences that we saw in planting dates and having so many planting dates at our site last year. Our March planting dates, believe it or not, were one of the first times I've had a planting date that didn't lodge at all. They stood the entire year, and part of that was they stacked internodes really closely to each other, and they were just shorter plants, shorter statured. So even though they had more nodes, they stacked those internode spaces close and didn't lodge. Our April planting dates, actually we didn't have, it was late in the year before those lodged as well, and it was somewhat varietal dependent, but they stood for a great portion of the year, again, due to, I would argue, shorter internode spaces. They just weren't as tall of plants. Now, when you got into May planting dates, it was a whole different ballgame. They were tall, mangly, a lot of vegetative growth, and they tended to lodge really early on us, especially at higher populations. And I would argue that when you get all that energy into vegetative growth and you get those tall, spindly plants that fall over, you're inevitably going to end up with lower pod counts too. And so this is, it's one that quite honestly, we focus a lot of time trying to look at strategies to help us with that, whether it be we've looked at trying to burn them back with herbicides early in the year. That strategy has not been the utmost effective, but it seems like our earlier planting dates with lower seeding rates, or in the case of 2016, even some of our May planting dates with lower seeding rates tended to help us a little bit mitigate against that. But part of that was just the rain we were getting, just the adequate moisture. We put a lot of effort into vegetative growth.
Okay, and last question. We have a lot of heavy red clay soil in Wisconsin. Do you still suggest the early planting date?
Yes, so this is always a question I get when I come to visit my friends in further northern geographies. I think you have to take it all in relation and relative to what's realistic in your scenarios. So I would encourage paying attention to soil temperature still. You don't want to do too many crazy things. Now, with that being said, I'll share a quick secret or a quick piece of information. We actually planted beans on February 19th here for entertainment purposes this year, just to see what would happen. And they're actually poking through, or just starting to poke through yesterday. So that was 43 days. And we had several nights of 15, 16 degree air temperatures. It's almost unbelievable, but we'll kind of follow that to see how that story ends. So I'll tell you that soybeans can deal with a lot more than you would give them credit for with a good seed treatment on them. But at the same time, you've got to balance, because once they're out of the ground, that's when the trouble really can hit you, especially as you get further north where you may have frost dates in May. You just want to make sure that you pay attention to your typical last frost dates and make sure that you're not in a scenario where you get those frosted off after they come up, and be smart about the soil temperature piece too. Don't push it to crazy levels, and especially if you're in a heavier textured clay soil that may not warm up quite as quickly. Those are things to take into consideration.
Okay, well, that concludes our webinar on solutions to effectively manage SCN and SDS. You will find the webinar and other soybean and agronomic resources on the checkoff funded website, ilsoyadvisor.com. Thank you for attending and have a great day.